The world can be forgiven thinking that it has been caught up in a Bond film plot because we've been treated to a pageantry of sheikhs bearing gifts, all worthy of specter. Leading up to COP28, the Center for Climate Reporting and Channel 4 News exposed the Saudi bigger-than-neighbor plot to snare Africa and Asia into a carbon-intensive future. With a faulty, self-serving, and ultimately self-destructive premise, if ever there was one, that poor nations must recapitulate the carbon-intensive history of the West as a precondition to a carbon-free future. We don't believe it's possible that developing countries can skip this fossil fuel phase because in order to implement electric vehicles fully, you'll need a ready infrastructure. That it's self-serving is pretty obvious, but I say faulty because the West is slowly coming to terms with the reality that car-centric development has been a very expensive detour into financial insolvency, and it's a detour that any town, city, or nation would be insane to pursue because it's walkable cities that nurture prosperity. Not only because they are much less expensive to build and sustain, but because they are commercially vibrant.
This is Crescent Village, a modern mixed-use development, because once again, these kinds of mixed-use walkable neighborhoods financially outperform car-dependent suburbia every single time.
The standard quote I have about this is car-free cities save time, lives, money, and energy, ultimately creating a dense, nutritious commercial environment. And because of this, the world has every reason to pursue them, not only as the most ecological, but most economical pathway to prosperity. Not only the developed world, but especially the rest of the world, does not need a glut of heavy fuel oil power stations, freeways, sprawl, and cheap cars. Nobody does. What we all need is a massive push to rework the foundation of the world economy, our cities, into walkable ones. And ironically, I think the petro-states, states like Saudi Arabia, Dubai, or the United Arab Emirates, need them as well. It's just basic economics. Their fabulous wealth collected from the energy sector also papers over their own car-centric Ponzi scheme, the same one the West suffers from.
I'm beginning to feel it in my heart. I feel thin, sort of stretched, like butter scraped over too much bread.
All petrostates live under what's called the resource curse. It comes from an economy grown around the extraction and export of raw materials, ones that become overspecialized and vulnerable to sector pricing. It's a trap the petrostates of the Middle East are well aware of, but their efforts to diversify from oil exports have largely failed.
Dubai is a work of art. Take the 3 Palm Islands. The first one still isn't fully occupied. The second one is apparently abandoned. The third one is cancelled. The World Islands, where no sane person wants to live, with all of them sinking into the sea at a rate of 5 millimeters per year, allegedly. See those tanks behind your multi-million-dollar villa? That is where your poop goes.
They have proven only competent drilling and selling oil. And the Saudi plot to aggressively expand oil consumption rather than expand around diversified pursuits suggests they have tacitly conceded failure. There's just something about living off the oil-rich fat of the land that seems to inspire unrealistic, grandiose, and futuristic schemes, which are also all the rage with billionaires, that regularly get shredded by civil engineers or the urban design crowd, like a ski resort in Dubai, or floating or linear cities. Sharp business and engineering acumen tends to take a little vacation when it comes to projects that amount to temples to one's ego. So, even if petrostates weren't playing Bond villain, they have a track record of sustainable development failure, as much as they'd like to convince the world otherwise. Beware sheikhs bearing gifts. Saudi Arabia might think that pressing Africa and Asia into a high-carbon future will secure their own, but they fail to factor in the ruinous cost of all the infrastructure required for it, imposed on nations that can ill afford this costly mistake. It will wreck the nations they target, and Saudi Arabia will end up with little to nothing for their efforts. This exemplifies the short-sightedness on the global stage. However, I am not going to lay the blame solely at Saudi Arabia's feet, because this level of short-sightedness is evident everywhere in the developed world, which has obsessed with the substitution of energy sources without reconsidering the financial insolvency of the entire system.
If we all reacted the same way, we'd be predictable, and there's always more than one way to view a situation. What's true for the group is also true for the individual. It's simple. Over-specialize and you breed in weakness. It's slow death.
The short-sightedness itself propagates out to the incredibly poor framing and high levels of inaction over climate mitigation. The operationalization, that's a big mouthful, isn't it, of the Loss and Damage Fund was hailed as an early win for COP28, even as it lacks adequate finance. Mitigation is still seen as a burden the world's poor are trying to impose on the developed world. However, if we don't invest in development and especially fail to aggressively mitigate climate crisis, the developed world, and dare I say, the petrostates of the Middle East, will suffer immensely. A case in point, a deadly necklace of water crises adorned the old world with some of the most dire festering right in the neighborhood of COP28, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, involving OPEC nations as well. The nations of Iran and Iraq are suffering dire water crises. And of the two, Iraq is in a much worse circumstance. The entire Tigris and Euphrates river basin is in serious trouble, both from climate change and water mismanagement, spearheaded by Turkey's aggressive water reclamation projects, diverting the waters of the two rivers for its own uses. The diversions have throttled the major water supplies of both Syria and Iraq. Iraq is in a particularly bad situation. It has no water treaty with Turkey, and they don't have a military option as well. Turkey is a member of NATO, so Turkey can do whatever they like with complete impunity, at least in the near term. If a nation loses its water supply, its productive capacity ceases to exist. That capacity on a global scale is lost to the world, in a world that is rapidly losing all sorts of agricultural capacity. And as the water supply fades, so will an entire nation, which means that its population will slowly drop out of the world economy. It can't trade with its neighbors, like Turkey, or more broadly, the EU. And because its population cannot survive where they are, they have a choice of either dying or becoming refugees. While Iraq will suffer an existential crisis first, Turkey itself is not immune to the same fate. If the Tigris and Euphrates rivers die, Turkey will also face a certain level of collapse. And NATO will lose a major military ally, and Turkey's population will also suffer the impoverishment and diminished economic potential. And they, unlike all the other immigrants the EU is getting up in arms about, have a right to emigrate. I don't know about the EU, but how many nations in it are really ready for this set of consequences? And I will remind people that Iraq is part of OPEC and part of the world's energy supply. It's important to remember this. Moving eastward, Iran faces many similar problems, but it is in a much better position. They have a water rights treaty with its neighbor, Afghanistan, and there's a little bit of an issue because the current management of Afghanistan is creative in the interpretation of the obligations the treaty stipulates. But Iran does have the option to retaliate militarily. In fact, the two nations have clashed more than a few times over water releases and a few other issues I won't get into here. They can at least work Afghans' nerves because they do have that leverage. It's not an option anybody would really care for, but it's there. I don't think the West's current policy towards Iran is particularly wise for many of the same reasons affecting Iraq. The loss of Iran's water supply, because the Helmand is being diverted into Afghans' internal use, will have the same effects overall. And again, I don't think that kind of crisis is something the world is really in a good position to tolerate. The West, particularly the US and EU, seem to be carrying on as if an immense climate crisis and economic collapse of either Iraq or Iran or Turkey hasn't had any influence on current foreign policy at all. But we're not done yet. The current management of Afghanistan, as popular as they are having a few other problems, this time on their eastern border. Pakistan is still reeling from the flood of 2022, which wiped out their GDP, and their ability to recover the resources they have are further limited because 60% of the remaining GDP is servicing foreign debt. Lending institutions and entities really only concern themselves with that repayment because they're creditors. That's their gig. But again, Pakistan has absolutely suffered a reduction in their productive capacity. And a desperate population is forced to consider emigration. Now, I want to point out a couple of things about that kind of forced immigration. You've got a population who can ill afford financial stress, but individuals who have decided to take the risk in dire circumstance often finance a trip by taking out loans from friends, neighbors, and family. If that trip ends in failure, the money is lost. And tragically, often the individual's life as well. Refugees represent not only social friction for destination nations, it is also integral to the mounting crisis of their homeland. The far eastern end of this necklace of crises is the situation in Southeast Asia. The headwaters to the Mekong lie within the territory of China, who, like Turkey, has never met a water reclamation project they didn't like. And like Turkey, there really isn't any remote chance of military confrontation. I mean, we're talking China. None of the nations in Southeast Asia could even remotely contemplate any trouble on that end. So it's not a matter of military instability, but But starving Southeast Asia of its water supply is not exactly in the economic interests of mainland China. China is not self-sufficient in food, and they rely on importation to round out their food supply. India used to be the world's largest exporter of rice, but due to climate change and a host of other issues, they've banned that exportation for a couple of years now. If China needs to import rice, they could turn to Vietnam or Thailand if they continue to export rice themselves. The aggressive hydroelectric dam construction of China has greatly disrupted the Mekong itself. Salinification, that is a product both of sea level rise and the disruption to the Mekong, is severely impacting rice production in Vietnam and Thailand. So it remains to be seen how much consideration China will give to this issue. There's a lot of other economic details in this that I'm not going to dip into. Taken collectively, neglect of this string of unfolding climate-related water crises across the old world represents a remarkable disinterest in the future economic prospects of the world's major economic players. The US, EU, China, and the petrostates are all failing to secure their own future economic prospects when they choose to view climate mitigation as a burden instead of an absolute necessity and golden opportunity. From sheikhs scheming to coerce the world's poor into a carbon-intensive variant of a known economic Ponzi scheme they themselves are victim to, the policymakers of the world's economies delude themselves by obsessing over carbon levels rather than the observation that modernity is defined by a spendthrift financial dead end. Ignoring climate mitigation while devoted to this dead end is truly an own goal. But that's what you get when you adopt a global, monolithic way of thinking. You breed in weakness.
Come with me if you want to live.